The story of the Underground Railroad through South Texas is a compelling story that has not yet made its way into the narrative of American history.
I think part of that is really because a lot of the way American history is told is really very Eastern, United States, East Coast driven.
Yet many freedom seekers chose to head south to freedom in Mexico.
People who lived in Texas who were enslaved, people who lived in Louisiana who were enslaved, would have found it much more practical to go down to the Rio Grande, where just south of the Rio Grande, Mexico had already abolished slavery. Mexico did by 1829.
But it wasn't an easy journey.
It was not easy to traverse our big state of Texas. There was a lot of ways in which you could get stopped, or whether it was a natural or physical barrier. But there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that once they got to the Rio Grande, they could see that light.
There were many reasons why Mexico was an appealing destination for enslaved people.
The Republic of Mexico at that time was not obligated, and in fact, they had made the decision that we do not take freedom seekers, runaway slaves, and send them back to Texas or the United States if somebody's asking for them.
But the story we have to tell is north of the border in Texas's Rio Grande Valley.
There were two families that were prominent in this, but two families that were almost keep this as a secret for many, many years, and for reasons that, I think we'll be able to glean shortly. But so one family is the Jackson family, and so the Jackson family was really guided by Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks.
According to family stories and the way that the descendants now recall what they've learned about Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks, that they were very religious.
Descendants like Diana Cárdenas, who learned her family's history from her grandmother. She took the time to show us her family's cemetery where Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks were laid to rest.
So Eli Jackson Cemetery, this is it.
That's where their journey ends, in one of two Jackson family cemeteries mere feet away from the recently erected border wall. But their story begins in Alabama.
Matilda Hicks was a slave, and she was a childhood friend of John Jackson's son, who was Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was a playmate of Matilda Hicks, fell in love, and they got married.
As a mixed-race family, life in Alabama was untenable for Nathaniel and Matilda, so they decided to gather a number of families, including freed slaves, and made the long journey south into Texas. Although Mexico was their original destination in 1857, they decided to settle in South Texas instead, purchasing a 5,500-acre ranch near modern-day Pharr, Texas. The newly established Jackson Ranch would become an outpost on the Underground Railroad.
He had brothers and sisters up in, Georgia, still, Alabama, that would come to visit. And so word got out, you want a great passage, you go that way, and they're going to help you into Mexico where you're not going to be caught.
Nathaniel opened up their community to these travelers, would house them and feed them and nurture them and offer them either a place to stay indefinitely or offer them assistance to go across the river.
Across the border to freedom in Mexico. The ranch community offered not only passage, but also a store, a school, a blacksmith, and a church where visitors could seek refuge and God.
It's the oldest Protestant Hispanic church in South Texas, and it still exists.
In South Texas, the Jacksons were able to build a community where they could live peacefully as a family, and Matilda could live not only as Nathaniel's partner, but also as an individual in the eyes of her community and the government.
So imagine you are a former female slave, and you come to an area where you don't have to look over your shoulder, where you can commune with your neighbors, and you can and be happy with your family, and live in peace. And then the census takers come around in 1860, 3 years after you arrive, and they want to know what your name is. And they want to know where you're from and what year you were born, like how old you are. And she's able to say, I'm Matilda Hicks. And she's listed on that census right under Nathaniel Jackson as the heads of household. Back in Alabama, weren't able to do that. They were just a check mark on a census because they were counted, but they weren't named.
The Weber story is also a fantastic story. And so that story is really about a young woman who was born into slavery.
Sylvia Hector came to Texas in the milieu of the Austin expedition with her enslaver John Cryer. In central Texas, she met John Weber, a veteran of the War of 1812. He would buy a large parcel of land and fall in love with Sylvia. In 1834, he would buy her freedom. And these are her freedom papers, found by Dr. Maria Hammock. I was able to find and speak with O.J. Trevino, a descendant of the Weber family, to discuss his family history, Hector, and her freedom papers.
Let's talk about how he secured her freedom. It came at a steep price.
The ask in these papers was for 2 children under the age of 5, was the ask. Now, however, they also did have some terms in there for collateral if they did not pay. They had a certain amount of time that they were required to pay and turn this over. The collateral for that was the Weberville land. So it was roughly, I think, over 800 acres of land plus $950 as well on top of that. And what we have come to find out and have documentation of is they did in fact forfeit, the payment and turned over the land as their payments.
Land that to this day still carries the family name, Weberville, Texas. But the negotiation gained Sylvia and her 3 children their freedom.
And they would then make the trek down to South Texas, where they would buy 8,000 acres worth of farm and ranch land right north of what is today Donna, Texas. That would become the Weber family ranch, and it would become an outpost on the Underground Railroad.
They had a licensed ferry on the Rio Grande and quickly established a reputation as a place where enslaved people could find refuge and safe passage to freedom in Mexico. But life along the border wasn't always easy for the couple. After all, they were Union sympathizers in South Texas.
We know that they were Union sympathizers. They were actually arrested by Rip Ford. He came knocking at their door, looking for them, and John, at that point in time, Weber, he closed the door on soldiers and said, something to the effect, you come back whenever you've got Rip with you. And so that's, what they had to do. They went, and Rip Ford himself had to come.
The incident mentioned in Confederate General Rip Ford's memoir, Rip Ford's Texas. The family was eventually released, but this firsthand account is one of the only existing written accounts of the Weber Ranch. According to Roseanne, after the Civil War ended, many of the documents kept by the Confederacy were burned, leaving many details of their story unknown. Also unknown, exactly how many enslaved people passed through the Weber and Jackson ranches on their way to freedom.
Well, we don't know the exact number. It's not like you register and you're like, I'm searching for freedom and this is where I'm going. It was more private and quiet and secretive.
According to Bacha Garza, some scholars have estimated that up to 10,000 enslaved people may have found freedom by crossing the Rio Grande.
We know that there were things happening with the Webers and the Jacksons based on the documents that we've seen. The Webers and the Jacksons have not been able to be as forthcoming because their ancestors kept the stories from them because they were of a mixed race family and there was a stigma associated with being black.
The self-esteem blocks that build your house. Your house is your self-concept. There was no blocks to be built. There wasn't anything. So a lot of us were taught to melt, and a lot of us did. We would strip ourselves of those vestiges that we thought were responsible for our lack of success. But going back to the story, it gives me a sense of pride. This is a story that to me, is a bright light that hasn't been allowed to shine.
Although their stories are rarely mentioned in literature, their names left out of the history books, and most of the documents that detailed their journeys lost to fire in the passage of time. The contributions of the Weber family and those of the Jackson family live on in the stories passed down through generations. Honoring Black history, I'm Sonya Hill.